Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Dan Dioka, Associate Professor in Practice at the GSD. I'm also a principal and co-founder of Interborough Partners, a planning and design firm based in New York City. As you probably can guess from the name of this studio, this is a studio about housing in Los Angeles. I am a total passionate lover of Los Angeles. I'm a complete housing nerd. I'm a general studio enthusiast, so I could not be more excited about this particular studio. I hope you are too. I know everyone is really busy and has a lot of presentations to watch, so I'm going to give you a quick 2-minute executive summary, then come back to tell the story in a little bit more detail. Let's dive in. As a studio, collectively, we're going to figure out where to put 255,000 new units of housing. This is a quantity experts say will satisfy demand and cool down the market somewhat. Along the way, though, we want to reimagine how the city houses its residents. After all, this is not just about quantity. The way in which Los Angeles has traditionally housed its residents is what accounts for headlines like these, or these, or these. And so there's really an opportunity here to create housing that's more sustainable, more affordable, more equitably distributed, and that generally works better for the people who call Los Angeles home today. So, big picture, working individually or in small teams, you will propose new housing and development topologies on unconventional sites, using bold new implementation tools, and with the aid of stakeholder coalitions. It's open to everyone. I'm really hoping to get a good mix of architects, landscape architects, urban planners, and urban designers. There's just one assignment, although I have it broken down into phases. First, you're going to do precedent research on the what, where, how, and who, your deliverable being these cards that allow for apples to apples comparisons. Second, armed with this research, you're going to make a board game about the politics of building housing. I assign board games often. Here are some examples from previous studios. You'll then spend the bulk of the semester on a proposition. Drawing on our research, you'll essentially make a formula. Build X on Y using Z with N and get to work. So in this random example, you're going to build co-ops in single-family neighborhoods using the transit-oriented community policy with a coalition of architects, unions, and developers. Totally random example. You'll pick a site. You'll work it out at the city neighborhood block and, if appropriate, building scale. At the city scale, I just want to ask you how many units this formula could produce. So if producing co-ops in single-family neighborhoods using the transit-oriented communities policy results in 25,000 units, that's great. As a studio, we're 10% of the way there, and you've pulled your weight. But most of your work will really be about kind of proof of concept, zooming in and showing how your formula would work in a particular place at a much closer scale. What you're looking at here are different housing projects from different option studios that I've run in the last couple of years. You see here that there are projects from all different departments and there's a range of scales and drawing types. I totally celebrate this. I think that for your project, probably you're all going to be comfortable at different scales, and that's a good thing. In the end, though, I'm going to ask you all to take those different drawings and package them up into something approximating a sales brochure. Talk a little bit about that later. We'll take a trip to Los Angeles. We'll see some excellent new housing. We'll see some changing neighborhoods. We'll hear from the leading architects, developers, planners, policymakers, and activists who helped build all this new housing. Maybe we'll hit the beach. We'll see some historic sites. And we will definitely eat some of the best food on the planet. All right, now the slow down version. There is, as you may know, a national housing shortage, so Los Angeles, like most cities in the US, just doesn't build enough housing to keep up with demand. This is a fact that has contributed to what is arguably the worst affordable housing crisis in the country and also a homelessness epidemic. To address this, California charged the city with a seemingly impossible task zoned for 255,000 new homes or forfeit billions of dollars in federal affordable housing grants. It seems like an impossible task because, where are you going to put 255,000 homes? It's not like there's a lot of vacant land in Los Angeles. Yes, there are parts of the city that aren't so dense and that can be upzoned and infilled. But upzoning and infilling has proved really contentious. You've heard of NIMBYism. Maybe you've heard of bananaism too. Yes, by all means, we need to upzone and infill neighborhoods like these. All neighborhoods, like maybe especially wealthy neighborhoods, have to pull their weight. But you'll also have to get creative when it comes to site selection, golf courses, highways, shopping centers, high schools, universities, airports, container ports, industrial zones, oil fields, parking lots. cemeteries. Okay, maybe not cemeteries, but you get the idea. But again, your first task, part of this kind of short research task designed to get you up to speed, you're going to pick an unconventional land topology, conduct research on it, and produce a sort of game card. Quantitatively, we'll want to know how much land each topology takes up, and therefore how many units we could potentially put there. Qualitatively, we'll want to understand the pros and cons of adding units on or in a place like this. Would these sites be feasible to develop? Would they be sustainable? So we want to walk away from this exercise with a big picture view of what might be possible, a compiled map that's sort of our universe of conceivable sites. Like I said earlier, this is not just a quantity problem. The challenge, as daunting as it is, presents an opportunity to radically reimagine how the city houses its residents. In the brief for low-rise housing ideas for Los Angeles, a competition that we'll look at pretty closely, Christopher Hawthorne, the organizer, writes that for much of the 20th century in Los Angeles, architectural experimentation focused on the same location, the single-family house. It was in the realm of the standalone single-family residence that Los Angeles essentially defined its own version, sun-dappled, forward-looking, often including a private garden or a swimming pool, of the American dream. He concludes by saying, this dream needs an update. Los Angeles is segregated, unequal, hardly sustainable. A single-family house has a lot to do with this. So in addition to creative thinking about sites, you'll have to think outside the box when it comes to housing and housing development topologies. What new housing and development topologies can we introduce that better match people's needs in the Los Angeles of today, that are more sustainable, that are more equitable? We'll look at a range of international examples, all of them denser than the single-family home, most of them cooperative actually in some way. We'll also look at recent good examples of more traditional topologies done well. These actually come from a publication I'm working on with Rahul Mehrotra and Chris Herbert at the Joint Center for Housing, along with the student team that actually includes our TA, Natalie Boverman. It's a survey of the best housing to be built in the past 2 or so years. We'll have the benefit of this research being conducted for the book. So you'll identify 2 housing/development precedents, a conventional one and a less conventional one. This is the complete list so far. We didn't get around to drawing each one. I did want you to see them. It's quite an extensive list. As with before, you'll want to research the quantitative, like how many units fit in your topology, how much carbon per person does it emit, as well as the qualitative. For example, what are the pros and cons of each topology, not only for residents, but for the city at large. Next up, we'll want to think about implementation. So there are a number of policies in place to increase housing generally and affordable housing more specifically. Many of them are shown here. Here's our complete list of these. Again, didn't get around to drawing all these. Some of these are local ordinances, some federal, some are neither. Indeed, some are purely aspirational. I do wish I had a little bit more time to dive into this list. It is fairly thorough. Our TA, Kiana Flores, is an LA native and is extremely well-versed in local housing policy and helped put this together. One I'd like to single out is public housing, sometimes called social housing. Hope maybe someone's interested in exploring this further. As you can see from these headlines, there are a lot of people in the housing community who think reinvesting in our public housing program is really one of the main ways that we can get out of our present affordable housing crisis. So everyone's going to pick one to research. For example, transit-oriented communities, local policy. On the other hand, there are a lot of policies that make it really hard to build housing. So you're going to pick one of these to research as well. I referred to NIMBYism earlier. A lot of people like things the way they are, and they actually go to great measures to keep things that way. And so sometimes they weaponize policies designed to do good things like protect the environment or preserve historic buildings to do some maybe not so good things like tie up affordable housing developments. My office actually wrote a book about this, kind of inventorying how otherwise sound policies like the California Environmental Quality Act have been weaponized actually to exclude. And we'll also have a chance here to look at other causes of the housing shortage. I don't mean to give the impression that it's only NIMBYism that explains why, for example, it can cost $750,000 to build an affordable housing unit in California. Finally, we want to get a chance of the actors. Who's who when it comes to housing in Los Angeles? Architects, developers, various federal, local, and state agencies, activists from across the political spectrum. We'll consider them all. NIMBYs, for example, have a card for them. So by the end of this process, we'll have a pretty good inventory of the who, what, where, when, why, and how of housing production in Los Angeles today. So this research will be the elements of a board game that each student will make. The purpose of this game is to explore how these different elements interact. I want to emphasize that this is not a standalone activity. This is meant as part of the overall project that you'll be doing of developing a proposition. Like I said before, this is something I often assign. You can see some board games from recent studios here. Some students like Yashwin here really take it to the next level. I actually think it's a great way to understand urban conflict, but I would say in this particular case, our brief is really suitable for this approach. You'll all have a lot of freedom to make the game that you want, but consider this as an example. You won't be flying blind here, by the way. My office makes a lot of games. We'll also get some input from our friends at Pandemonium Books and Games in Central Square. So at this point in the semester, right after the field trip, believe it or not, you'll be in a great position to put together a proposition. Again, build X on Y using Z with N. This is how you'll spend the next 10 weeks, building on the work you've done, building on your burgeoning understanding of the topologies of land, of different policies, building on your understanding from the game that you made of how these things kind of interact and create housing. You make a proposition, you'll find a particular site to test it out on, and you'll get to work. I made this point before, I'll make it again. Given that I expect to have students with different backgrounds, I do expect drawings to be very different. That's totally fine. Should work at a scale that's comfortable to you. There are a few basic things I'll be looking for each project. You can see the list here. So again, whatever drawings you make, you'll take and package up and put into something like a sales brochure along the lines of what you see on the screen here. Los Angeles is a city that, despite its obsession with the single-family house, has been incredibly inventive when it comes to housing. It's a city that's home to a staggering number of residential topologies, all of which creatively solved housing crises of the past. Among them are what you see here, the bungalow courtyard, the apartment tower, the tower in the park, the garden suburb, the tract house. Los Angeles, invented the infamous dingbat. So what we want to do in the studio is kind of rekindle this spirit of inventiveness. And so what I'm asking you to do here is to, again, take your idea, whether it's a Baugruppen or a co-housing, a land trust, a tiny home village, make a pitch for it, right? Put it into a brochure and try to sell it to a skeptical public. I have assigned versions of this assignment before. Sometimes students kind of go to town on it. This was a student who decided to make a kind of exhibition in a box to go along with the brochure. This is a student who did a kind of storybook version of the pitch based on earlier architectural books about Los Angeles. This is a student who turned his entire project basically into a comic book. I hope that people will have fun with this final deliverable for the project. Last thing, we do have a pretty extensive bibliography. There's no required reading, but there are a lot of great books about housing in Los Angeles, and you may wish to seek some of them out depending on what you're working on. That's about it. I'm well over time. Thank you for listening. And I, again, just want to stress how excited I am about this studio. I think it's going to be a really great one. It's one that needs the creativity and the energy of students in every single department at the GSD. Hope you'll consider joining. Any questions between now and when you have to sign up, just shoot me an email. Hope to see you soon.